Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Paul Locke, and I want to welcome you to the Contingency Planning for Animals panel. I also want to thank you very much again for joining us, and I'd also like to acknowledge our gold sponsor, Chapman, Cubine, Allen, and Hussey. We really appreciate their sponsorship of this section. Now, this session is going to include pre-recorded videos and presentations, which will be followed by a Q&A, and that will be with our panelists live. But before we get started, I just want to point out a couple of interactive features located on the right-hand side of your screen. First, if you notice, all resources and PowerPoint presentations are located under handouts. And we'll be hosting a live Q&A at the end of this panel. So please click on Q&A to submit your questions. Okay, so now without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have just three really terrific panelists here, and my introductions are greatly shortened, not really do them justice, so please do go to the web pages for them so you really know more about their backgrounds. I'm going to start with Nancy Perry. She leads ASPCA's legislative and policy work in DC and really across the US. She has a proven track record of supporting and enacting animal protection laws and policies over her 16-year career. Next, I want to introduce Nathan Hirschler. He's the executive director of Rise for Animals, and he's an experienced attorney, advocate, and strategist, and a lifelong advocate who has committed himself to animal protection and the improvement of programs that serve the needs of animals. Our third panelist is Dan Ash. He's the president and CEO of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which has over 200 organizations and 6,000 individuals as members. He's a lifelong animal conservationist who has extensive experience on Capitol Hill and as a leader at the Fish and Wildlife Service. So without further ado, let's begin the presentations.
Hi, this is Nancy Perry. I want to thank you for inviting me to join in on this extremely pressing issue area. I congratulate this conference for setting up a theme around climate change. It feels like the most pressing concern in our quest to protect animals today. I wanted to start by looking at what it means to contingency plan and what the word contingency actually means in terms of levels of certainty. An event that may but is not certain to occur. So that was where I started my own inquiry. And I think as we walk through these areas of animal protection and planning, I think we should consider just how uncertain these events need to be before we simply call this routine planning. We're looking at the science and seeing that these circumstances are truly not very uncertain anymore. Most weather-related disasters we need to plan for are now scientifically inevitable, and their intensity and duration are on the rise. And the unfortunate truth is that in the area of contingency planning for animals, we are barely keeping our heads above the water. Let's start by looking at the types of events that we need to plan for. The most obvious are weather events, and there are an extraordinary number of them, and they seem to be increasing, and new and different types of weather disasters are emerging. This year has shown us how critically important it is to plan for the inevitability of pandemics as well. And I'm afraid we also need to be thinking about social unrest and what kinds of impacts that could have on animals. And when you combine all of the above, what you see are severe supply chain breakdowns that impact the largest group of animals under our care in society today. All of these also have secondary impacts that we'll look at. First and foremost, let's look at kind of the traditional categories that we would examine for planning: pets and privately owned domesticated animals. There are thousands of animals that live under the care of the Animal Welfare Act and their licensees. So we'll look at how to protect them in a disaster. Finally, we'll look at animals on the farm, and we'll look at them on the farm, but also in the slaughterhouse and how they're impacted by disasters. And then we'll end with a word on prevention. Starting with the somewhat traditional area of disaster protection for animals, which is based at local levels, state levels, and to some extent, the federal level. There are a number of policy needs that have arisen since our awareness was raised around Hurricane Katrina. We have learned how critical it is to care for animals and how it also helps us care for people. Most of this work does have to happen at the more local levels of government. And on a heartening note, we are seeing that happening as communities are coming to expect weather disasters. They hit more often now and with greater frequency and intensity. And communities are preparing, but there still are very significant needs that we can resolve by working on policy solutions. We need to mobilize resources for training and equipment to enable our first responders to better handle and care for animals. The ASPCA's National Capabilities for Animal Response and Emergency Survey, or NCARE, is a cross-sectional survey that's designed to assess the level of preparedness throughout the US. This survey revealed that 75% of responding states and counties have reported needs for additional emergency training, expertise, and equipment. Responders also noted that animals are often affected by hazardous chemicals and materials, and they need ways to address that. And local first responders need both proper equipment and training to care for the health of the animals that are kept in their care after disasters end. We also have to provide flexibility for veterinarians to more easily deploy across state lines. While HHS's National Veterinary Response Team, or NVERT, has been helpful in major disasters to mobilize veterinarians in affected communities, each year there are more and more instances where local veterinarians become overwhelmed during disasters that simply don't meet NVERT's activation threshold. In such cases, federal policy should be encouraging states to provide out-of-state veterinarian waivers and other flexibility so that these experts can deploy and get to animals that are in need in the field. We also need to streamline our interstate animal transport regulations during disasters. State requirements for health certificates for individual animals in a large-scale relocation during declared disasters often prevents our swift and needed action due to the conditions. Federal policy should really standardize and expedite the processes the states use to ensure animal health and welfare during these events. As more localities are evacuating unowned, adoptable animals prior to predictable disasters like hurricanes, there's a pressing need for more flexibility here. We should also promote cohabitated and co-located shelters. Lessons learned from past disasters have demonstrated that keeping pets and people together during disasters, wherever possible, is safer and more efficient and effective in promoting good welfare for animals as well as their owners. Cohabitated shelters where people and their pets are housed actually together, and co-located shelters where the shelters are close enough in proximity that people can provide the care for their animals, are both very effective and successful strategies, as witnessed by Florida's enactment of a new law requiring these types of shelters in every single county in the state. And Florida is one of those states that has better disaster preparedness than most any other state. So this is a real indicator of the future. Finally, animals get lost during disasters, and we need to incentivize identification strategies that will help dogs, cats, birds, horses, every type of species to find their way back to their family. So that's one area of disaster preparedness we can do better in. But there are thousands of animals inside puppy mills, exhibitions, and research laboratories who are extremely vulnerable when disaster strikes. Surely those animals must be covered by federal law. Don't we have requirements for plans for those animals? Unfortunately, we don't. Federal law doesn't require those plans right now, but we have worked closely with key leaders in Congress to promote the Prepared Act, HR 1042. This acronym stands for Providing Responsible Emergency Plans for Animals at Risk of Emerging Disasters. And this is an amendment to the Animal Welfare Act that would require all licensees under that act to develop and implement emergency plans. This legislation is authored by Representative Dinah Titus and Peter King, a nice Democrat-Republican combo. It has 217 co-sponsors, so it is one away from having a majority of the House supporting it. And it enjoyed the benefit of having a hearing earlier this year where the ASPCA was able to testify in its favor. Ironically, the COVID pandemic not only derailed the legislative momentum we had for it, but the agency actually stopped inspecting puppy mills and other licensees due to the pandemic. So we've had a double whammy on this issue, and we hope to recover very quickly and get this legislation back on track. But what about farm animals? The largest number of animals that we have in this country. What kinds of protections exist for them? We're talking about 9 billion chickens in the United States raised for meat. We also have 300 million hens that are raised for egg production. We have 120 million pigs that are used for their meat annually in the US. What laws provide help for these animals in a disaster setting? Who's there to protect them when their housing is threatened by winds, fires, or floods? And what about when the supply chain breaks down? Let's take a look at what modern farming looks like. Modern agriculture has moved indoors. These are areas where animals cannot escape. And these large sheds that contain thousands of animals are often located in floodplains. These industrial operations also have their own containment ponds for their waste, and these lagoons easily can overflow in weather-related disasters, creating a second lethal threat. Just recently in Hurricane Florence, we saw that 3.5 million animals in agriculture died during this disaster, mostly in the state of North Carolina. This is the state that houses the largest hog production in the country, and it's in the direct path of hurricanes. So this cycle of loss of life and terrible animal suffering will continue as storms intensify. Can't the federal government do something to help ensure farm animals survive? Surely we have policies that encourage their protection in a disaster. Unfortunately, when you look up USDA's robust reimbursement program, the Livestock Indemnity Program, or LIP, we see that livestock producers are actually reimbursed for the loss of life with no requirements for precautions or preventative action whatsoever. And in fact, contract growers, so those who are not owners of the animals they raise, are not even eligible for losses for injured livestock. So basically, they are incentivized to ensure that animals do not survive these events. That's why increasingly we have seen barn doors close, cages left closed, and the inevitable drowning deaths of millions of animals in these events. What about those animals who aren't so intensely confined? Some of them have the opportunity to flee, and I guess in a sense, these are the lucky ones. But unfortunately, in a flooding event, they'll be exposed to contamination and hazardous materials that are frequently present in the water. They're also without food, fresh water, and shelter, often for many days or even weeks, because they're the last to receive help. And if the shed rows and the hog houses do happen to survive the impact of the storm, even those confined animals face really lethal secondary impacts. They have to survive without food, water, or shelter because these facilities are not designed to go without power. They're dependent on entirely mechanized food delivery systems, watering systems, ventilation, cooling and temperature control, even heating. So surviving a disaster is no guarantee that an animal in our modern industrial agriculture setting will actually be free of suffering. But all of these dangers pale in comparison to the risk that farm animals face during a pandemic, as we learned this year. There are a number of ways they're at greater risk of suffering and dying once a virus takes hold and spirals out of control. And the irony here is that the institutional forms of animal suffering in our agricultural systems that involve their abuse and close confinement actually create the viruses that lead to pandemics almost every time. We're aware that many of these viruses have emerged over the last century, and they seem to be emerging more swiftly than ever. There are a whole host of viruses that have jumped from animals to humans. What is the result of these viruses and these resulting pandemics? In intensive confinement systems, animals are subjected to tremendous stress, and that suppresses their immune systems, and they're housed so closely that any viral load at all can cause mass spreading to the entire herd or flock. Once a virus spreads on an industrial farm, mass cullings take place, where animals are killed in gruesome ways, including mass burials, and sometimes even while they're still alive. But it doesn't end there. When viruses do make that leap to the human population and then create a pandemic, our fragile food system fails the animals again. We have supply chain breaks because of this fragility. Institutional needs will change overnight. And when schools and restaurants close and consumers change their consumption needs drastically, even moving towards local networks, which could be a good thing, this level of disruption causes tremendous risk for farm animals. The food supply system is set up like a Jenga game. And if the wrong piece is removed, the entire system will topple. And that's exactly what happened this year during this pandemic that we're still suffering under. Industrial farms are incredibly vulnerable. Demand changed, then these operations had nowhere to send their animals to market. This glut would not have been a problem if producers could simply hold on to the animals they've raised, but they're not equipped to keep those animals. They don't have housing, food, knowledge, or resources to do that. So they were forced to resort to mass culling of healthy animals. We still don't know how many hens, sheep, pigs, and cows have been killed, as none of this information is required to be disclosed to the public. But we do know that these mass killings continue, as once the supply chain is disrupted, it's very difficult for it to recover. And even now, 6 months after the full emergence of this pandemic, these horrible depopulation events are still continuing. Let's talk about the methods used to depopulate these operations. We have to first remind ourselves this is not euthanasia. Depopulation is the swift destruction of an entire flock or herd of animals due to a sudden circumstance. And it's typically been employed after disasters or disease outbreaks. Euthanasia is a painless or near painless form of killing an animal to spare that individual from further suffering. The method that is currently under debate and being utilized in great frequency from all we can tell is ventilation shutdown, or VSD. This is where the producer shuts the barn's ventilation system down with the animals sealed indoors. And sometimes they even add heat to the mix. So the animals will die from some combination of hyperthermia, carbon dioxide, and other gases that accumulate in the barns. Their death is caused by heat stress and suffocation. This process is inhumane and extremely distressing for the animals, who may take hours to die. Another method of depopulation, also horrible for the animals to endure, is the use of water-based foam depopulation methods. This is something that was adapted from firefighting foam, foam that is highly capable of obstructing oxygen for a fire. It does the same thing to an animal's airway and causes death over several stressful, agonizing minutes. Neither VSD or water-based foam are approved methods by the World Organization for Animal Health, even in extreme cases. Unfortunately, the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, has failed to declare these unacceptable options, even though the ASPC asked them in 2017 to please make clear that these are never acceptable ways of killing large numbers of animals. Unfortunately, the industry has walked through the open door there, and they continue to point to the AVMA not saying that these are unacceptable and still allowing these as methods of depopulation. So they are used as a shield for arguably the worst cruelty ever visited upon animals in our history. Beyond that, you would think that COVID relief funds would at least not go to any producers that employ such gruesome methods of mass depopulation. The ASPCA has been working with a broad coalition urging that these funds never reimburse to anyone using these gruesome methods. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and we believe that those COVID relief funds have been dispersed regardless of that. We have such a fragile food system, and it's so dependent on massive volumes of consumption that we literally can't slow it down. And this system has zero ability to adapt to completely predictable events. We're allowing producers to burn animals alive in the event of a disaster. Hyperthermia is the technical term, which means to die from overheating or to roast alive. And given the increasing rate of viruses and natural disasters, this is not really a contingency. It's predictable. It will happen. And it will happen again unless we reimagine our entire food system. There is an argument taking place around extreme speed slaughter. This is one last horrible impact from disasters that we all have to work to stop. You know, Americans are having trouble right now agreeing on anything, but 94% of Americans agree that animals raised in our food system deserve to be free from pain and suffering. Even before the pandemic, the USDA has been moving towards speeding up already breakneck line speeds in the slaughterhouse. This already was a raging debate, and even the default speeds were blindingly fast. But now USDA is moving as fast as it can to implement more and more extreme line speeds, even removing any limit whatsoever for the slaughter of pigs. This really needs to stop. These animals are already vulnerable on the day they go to slaughter, and they should be subjected to absolutely no additional suffering during that process. This policy by USDA must be turned around, and I hope that you will join us in working toward that end. But ultimately, I think we all can see from looking at all of the risks that animals face on the farm that what we really need is an entirely different form of farming, an entirely new vision. We need better certification standards implemented far more broadly. We need a reduction in the number of animals in this system, and we really need the Farm System Reform Act. The Farm System Reform Act has been proposed and introduced by Senator Booker and Representative Khanna in the Senate and in the House. And this would place an immediate moratorium on the expansion of construction of any new confined animal feeding operations. It would phase out all CAFOs by 2040. It also would provide funding to help farmers transition to higher welfare farming or to growing fruits, vegetables, and other crops. And it creates reforms to hold factory farms accountable for how they treat contract farmers, as well as pervasive environmental pollution they inflict on local communities. So I hope you will join us in our efforts to enact this legislation. It is seriously what we need in order to make changes that will really remove our need for so much emergency planning around farm animals. Ultimately, though, I think in our effort to protect animals, we need to develop another muscle, and that is our prevention muscle. Prevention needs to become our favorite tactic. We cannot look away from what we know to be true. We know that all of these weather impacts are coming. We know that pandemics will occur. And we know that many, many animals are in harm's way because of that. So we need to anticipate what those shifting needs will be. We need to become more comfortable with pragmatic solutions that we offer in advance of disasters happening. And we need to embrace proactive options. We face this situation even with wildlife. We have herds of wild free-roaming horses and burros on public lands that have never been adequately protected. And we really cannot look away and try to pretend that those animals are going to be safe given the changing weather patterns. They will suffer and die in extreme ways if we don't offer new management strategies for them as well. So you see, there's really no animal left untouched as we talk about emergency planning. And I think that it is very difficult sometimes to be prevention oriented. It's hard to sell those solutions. It means putting your cards on the table. It means working with players you don't agree with. It also means finding compromise that will actually secure those protections in the short term. But it's better than averting our eyes when mass die-offs occur and when scientific data is clear that these animals are directly in harm's way. Leaving the protection of all these animals up to chance, whether in homes, in institutional settings, on farms, or in the wild, is not an option we can justify anymore. Thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome you to join us in solving these problems we've looked at today.
Thank you to ALDF and to Lewis and Clark Law School for hosting us. And thank you to Nancy for that excellent presentation. There are a couple things on there that I'm excited to build off of. So the title of my presentation today is Animal Experimentation Interrupted. I am the executive director for an organization called Rise for Animals, which for the last 125 years has been known as the New England Anti-Vivisection Society, and we just went through a rebrand. So don't be surprised not having seen this name before. This presentation is going to explore the impact of natural and man-made disasters on animals and research labs. We're going to start by exploring the various harms and injuries experienced by those animals in disaster situations, quickly go through some existing weaknesses in the current laws and regulations, specifically as they apply to animals and labs. We're going to go through a new tool that we are launching by the time that you all are seeing this, but next Monday, which is in late October. And then we're going to review the Prepared Act and some of the strengths as it applies to animal experimentation and how it may address some of the issues associated with how labs are currently treating this problem. But before we get into any of that, knowing that animal experimentation is not the most popular area of the animal protection movement at this point, just some high-level statistics for everybody. So I think importantly, we are in a situation now where technology has advanced pretty substantially, and yet we're still working with the tools that animal experimenters and researchers have been using for more than 100 years at this point in America. And the statistics bear out how ineffective and inefficient the existing processes are. 95% of animal experiments that are undertaken fail to lead to any sort of meaningful product that's to be used for humans, either failing in clinical trials or not being marketed for some other reason. The US government, and so our tax dollars, funds NIH at $15 billion a year for animal experimentation. And the total number, including military funding, which is harder to unpack, may be as high as $30 billion a year. And we believe that there are more than 2 billion animals that have died in animal experimentation in the last 20 years, about 100 million a year. And that may be a very conservative estimate, considering there is no federal requirement for counting the vast majority of animals that suffer in labs around the country. But specifically about animals in disaster situations, much like Nancy laid out for farmed animals, there are a number of different examples of that have become public of animals suffering pretty substantially as a result of animal experimentation and the disasters that impact it. In 2017, during Hurricane Sandy, there were a number of animals that were able to be effectively relocated from NYU's Langone vivarium facilities. Unfortunately, a significant number of animals also died in that process. That included up to 35,000 mice and a number of other animals. This in addition to the loss of animal life, led to a substantial economic impact of more than $25 million. More recently, COVID-19 has been interrupting lab animal research, sometimes fatally, and I also will be talking about depopulation, much as Nancy did, and the difference between that and normal euthanasia methods as it relates to lab animals. I'll get to that in just a couple minutes. And then during Tropical Storm Allison, there was another horrific example where 35,000 animals kept in the basements of the Texas Medical Center at Baylor and the Texas Heart Institute led to drownings of these animals after they were unable to be effectively removed from that dangerous situation. So much like for farmed animals, lab animals also suffer in disaster situations. And this isn't a small problem. Just to very quickly go through where labs are across America. So this is just a quick slide to highlight where all of the Animal Welfare Act covered labs and animal experimentation facilities are in the United States. And then these are the various different overlays of different types of disasters. And so these are animal labs that exist in the continental US with high fire risk, with high tornado risk, with high hurricane risk, and with high flood risk. And so the normal remediation strategy for the labs once they are encountered with this type of threat to the existing research and the animals is that they move forward into depopulation strategies. And very similarly to how Nancy was describing this, depopulation differs from traditional euthanasia methods by and large. The AVMA has put out recommendations for labs in the event of catastrophic situations like this that encourages them to take relatively humane methods for smaller mammals like mice and rats, which make up about 95% of the animals that suffer in animal experimentation. And euthanasia type of tactics, injection type of euthanasia tactics for the dogs and cats that suffer in animal experimentation. But kind of horrifically, for those few large and small primates, they provide almost no recommendations at all. For great apes, the AVMA suggests that it is possible to shoot those animals in the head with a gun. For smaller primates, they pretty explicitly say that because the animals are smaller, there's a higher risk of the bullets from those shots ricocheting and injuring people who were not the anticipated targets. So unlike traditional euthanasia methods in the lab context, some of the suffering that has been experienced by animals is also way outside of the norm. So unlike for the farmed animals, there are dual regulatory systems that impact animals in experiments. In addition to the Animal Welfare Act, most federal facilities or most facilities that receive federal funding, which comes to about 95% of those animal experimentation facilities, are also funded by NIH. And that means that they have to comply with the standards that are set by the NIH and the Public Health Service. One of those tools that we have through the NIH's regs is that the labs are required to submit annually a Public Health Service assurance, part of which is that those labs are required to have disaster plans in place. Unfortunately, there are 56 facilities in the US that have no disaster plan requirement, and that's largely because they're doing private contract work with animals rather than receiving federal funding. Unfortunately, simply having a plan, which is all that is required under the PHS assurances, is inadequate. A 2013 originally recommendation from the National Academy of Sciences in coordination with HHS and NIH recognized that there was a substantial problem with the way that labs were currently planning for contingencies related to disasters. and made a series of recommendations. Things as simple as assigning a senior individual who would be responsible for preparing disaster resilience plans, implementing training to run animal care technicians through what would actually need to occur in the context of a disaster. Developing performance-based standards and an institutional financial investment plan for resilience. And so not just the long-term care for these animals that are impacted by disasters, but also the real cost of what it's going to take to restart all of the animal experimentation that we know doesn't work, but is still required for federal regulatory purposes. So how could anybody possibly unpack what is happening at the various animal experimentation facilities near you? I'm going to quickly go through a new tool that's launching on my next Monday and in the past for you. So you all be able to go visit this the day of the presentation if you're interested in learning more. But our organization very recently developed and implemented a new project, which is a massive database project that I'm going to go through right now. So ARLO stands for the Animal Research Laboratory Overview, and it's a compendium of essentially all federal records related to animal experimentation in the country. And so as you can see, it's a relatively robust tool. We have over 17,000 records at this point, representing more than 83,000 pages of FOIA received records. You can see here that we're clicking on the University of Washington to get an example of what the type of information you are able to find is. You can see the total animal counts and the types of animals, the species of animals that are covered, including dogs and cats at this facility. You can see that we've had a pretty substantial reduction in the number of animals over the last 6 years at this facility, from 2,578 to 2,140 in 2019. We have the ability to automatically populate graphs to help with messaging around the stuff, and this is going to be related to trend lines for each of the individual species and the total numbers of animals. And then you can dig deeper by looking at the actual records that are attributable to each of these different research facilities, ranging from the various PHS assurances, which discuss disaster preparation, to violation records, and the annual reporting that needs to go both to the animal welfare, to the USDA for the Animal Welfare Act, and to NIH for the PHS reporting requirements. There's also links to media on this, and so you can see some of the recent articles around investigations that have happened in the animal experimentation facilities at the labs around the country. You can go to the websites themselves of the various facilities. You can go to their Facebook pages, so you can start to do some online advocacy right away. And you can see various leadership structures. So who are the people that serve on the committees that approve the animal welfare strategies for animal experimentation, and other important targets for campaigning purposes. We also have a link to the NIH's research database that will allow people to identify the various types of research that is occurring at each of these facilities with a handy little link. This is all stuff that's publicly available. And the Trump administration, for example, did not remove this in the same way that they did with the Animal Welfare Act databases. So to ensure against all of that type of work in the future, we've built this database, and we're managing a really robust FOIA factory at this point, and we will be continuously updating this database on an annual basis with records from every single research facility in the United States. Okay, so we're quickly going to go in here to sort of look at some of the records associated with a disaster situation and the PHS assurances. So you can search with keywords here. We're looking for disasters. And we're going to click on one of these examples down here, so you can see what the specific PHS assurances are going to have as it relates to animal experimentation. Right now we're clicking on the Mass General Hospital, which is just down the street from us. And just a quick note that you can also look at the various state laws and the open records laws that apply to animals and labs and the welfare strategies and how you can get additional information through tools like the Freedom of Information Act in the various state jurisdictions that are covered in the Arlo database. Finally, we have generic actions that anybody is able to take, and those are going to be embedded directly into the various Arlo pages for each of the facilities. So you can take action from the database site itself, but you can also take independent action. And then just really quickly on the Prepared Act. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the National Academy of Sciences, along with HHS and NIH, assessed the existing PHS assurances and how labs are currently dealing with the situation of potential disasters. And they found pretty explicitly that the current guidelines are incomplete and inconsistent with the existing national preparedness systems. They found that there are almost no disaster resilience or training resources for the animal research community. And there was a specific recommendation that the academic research institutions should acknowledge that there's an ethical imperative to preserve the lives and prevent the suffering of research animals. Unfortunately, the regulated community of research facilities killed that last attempt at setting guidelines for the protection of animals in labs and disasters, and that was in 2012 and 2013, which speaks to the need, again, as Nancy stated earlier, to pass the Prepared Act to effectively protect those animals in labs. So just to reiterate the point, labs have a moral obligation to protect the animals under their care. They are arguably, from their perspective, doing this work that hurts animals to protect human health and safety. Although we have a fundamental disagreement about the reality of that situation, we do believe that at a minimum, we can agree that labs have a moral obligation to protect the welfare of those animals under their care. And the NIH agrees with us. NIH, along with HHS and the National Academies, recently stated in that report that a safer future for research animals can be made if the animal research communities will only adopt disaster resilience as a mindset and apply it at each opportunity to build housing systems, when they're building new vivariums for the animals or even renovating their existing ones. So basically the recommendation was to build in disaster resilience planning from the outset of every decision that is made in the context of animal experimentation. I believe that that's something that we must do at a minimum on the pathway towards ending animal experimentation as quickly as possible and making sure that no further animals have to suffer in this horrendously cruel way of trying to protect both animal and human health. So thank you. If you'd like to contact me or anybody else at Rise for Animals, there's some contact information for you over here. If you want to go explore Arlo, the database that we have, please do. It's at arlo.riseforanimals.org. And definitely peruse some of the other types of campaign materials at riseforanimals.org, where you can see that it's not just factory farmed animals, but also factory farms for animals like dogs. There's a campaign that we're running right now against Marshall Bioresources in upstate New York, where 23,000 dogs are kept in warehouses, much like you saw in Nancy's presentation, with effluence pits and all, providing the same type of threats to the human populations around there. So it's not just chickens, pigs, and cows that are impacted by this type of factory farming situation, but even animals like beagles, dogs. And so we have an obligation to help, and that's what we're going to keep doing and fighting every day for. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Ash, and it's a pleasure to be with you and speak with you today, although I do have to admit it's always challenging to speak with people when you can't see the people. I'm not going to make a formal presentation today. I'm going to try to just speak with you about the importance of nurturing a culture of planning and preparedness as we aspire to adapt to a disrupted climate system. Prior to joining the AZA in 2017, I had a long career at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and from 2011 to 2017, I was honored to serve as the agency director under President Barack Obama and working with Interior Secretaries Ken Salazar and Sally Jewell. In September of 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was the first federal natural resource agency to develop a climate change strategic plan. I led the development of that plan, actually beginning in the George W. Bush administration, and it was built on the foundations of the 2007 Fourth Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that report's fundamental conclusion that warming of the climate system is unequivocal and very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. So, despite our current national dysfunction, there is a growing consensus that climate warming and related ecological disruptions and hazards are very real. And because we've not acted forcefully to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to live with climate disruption for decades to come. Adaptation and preparation will be key elements of our response strategy as storms, floods, droughts, and all types of natural disasters become more frequent and more intense. I'm proud to say that facilities accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums are leading the way in preparedness to protect people, infrastructure, and of course, animals, non-people animals. Accreditation is foundational to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Membership is conditioned on achieving and maintaining accreditation. AZA accreditation is the gold standard for a modern zoological facility and signifies excellence. We currently have a record 240 accredited members in 13 nations, and our membership continues to grow. And in fact, in just the past 2 weeks, we've welcomed 2 new facilities into our Pathway Toward Membership program. A significant element of AZA accreditation involves emergency planning and preparedness. In fact, the preamble to our accreditation standards lists 13 distinguishing characteristics of accredited members, including this one: comprehensive preparedness in public and animal safety. This characteristic is recognized throughout our standards and has created a culture of planning, preparedness, response, learning, and sharing within and beyond our community of members. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Animal welfare and wellness is addressed in Standard 1.5.0 and requires each institution to have a process for assessing animal welfare and wellness and calls for a mechanism to identify and evaluate welfare and wellness impacts of significant life events, including unusual weather events. Standard 2.0.3 addresses veterinary care and mandates that an institution be prepared for periodic disease outbreaks with written plans in place to protect animals. The institution must also prevent animal and veterinary records from loss due to catastrophe. Multiple aspects of our finance standards are relevant, including 9.3, which requires liability insurance coverage for visitors, staff, and facilities. Standard 9.5 requires written contingency plans covering significant decreases in operating income, recommending that facilities have financial contingency plans covering 3 to 6 months of operations. And I believe that this requirement has been a key factor in the resiliency of our members during the current COVID-19 pandemic. By late spring of this year, 95% of our members were closed. Those closures averaged 3 months in duration, with the average AZA facility losing $1 million monthly. So I think that AZA members have distinguished themselves during this pandemic by sustaining these significant losses without compromising animal care. And that's a reflection of their preparedness and planning, and the fact that that has become and is a culture within the AZA community. Standard 10.2.2 requires systems for 24/7, 365 fire protection and facility security. In fact, our standards address facility safety and security exhaustively, requiring employee and volunteer training, zoonotic disease training, toxic and hazardous substance training, and emergency provisions must be written, and an integrated emergency management and response system like an incident command system is strongly recommended. An emergency communication plan and a written risk management plan are required. And at least 4 live action drills must be held annually, with at least 1 in each of 4 areas: fire, weather or other environmental emergency that's appropriate to the area, injury, and animal escape. Most members do much more than the minimum required drills, of course. And Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, for instance, does monthly drills. So it's not just planning, it's planning, prevention, preparedness, practice, and evaluation of performance that are, in fact, distinguishing characteristics of AZA accredited zoos and aquariums. This is good for the business of running an aquarium or zoo because it's good for the guest, the employee, the volunteer, the facility, and of course, the animals for whom the facility is home. And we see this reflected in the record of our members in the face of increasingly frequent and increasingly disruptive natural disasters. Looking at the last decade, we've experienced multiple and catastrophic hurricanes, including Sandy, Harvey, Irma, and recently, Laura, Sally, and Delta. Catastrophic Western fires, freakishly unpredictable and intense storms like the hailstorm that ravaged Cheyenne Mountain Zoo on August 8th of 2018, and repeated flooding in places like Cleveland, where Cleveland Metro Parks Zoo has experienced 5 100-year floods in the last 5 years. Yet, excluding fish, and I'm going to come back to fish, we've lost fewer than 3 dozen animals as a result of the last decade's catastrophic events. Most of these birds, like the vulture and duck lost at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo during the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo hailstorm. Hurricane Laura caused devastating damage at Alexandria Zoo in Louisiana, yet no animals escaped or were injured. And this summer saw a repeat of the 2018 hailstorm at Cheyenne Mountain Zoo with no animal or visitor injuries. I'm not saying or suggesting that any animal loss is acceptable, but I am saying that the record of AZA member facilities, buttressed by this culture of planning and preparedness, is remarkable. So come back to fish. Losses of fish have been more substantial in these natural disasters, and I think that's due to the particular vulnerabilities of aquariums when they lose power for sustained periods. But again, preparedness has shown improvement. In 2005, Audubon Aquarium in New Orleans suffered a total loss of their fish population in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, about 10,000 animals. In 2011, despite massive facility damage from Hurricane Sandy, the New York Aquarium was able to save 85% of its animals. So when we know better, we do better. And the culture of planning, preparedness, learning, and sharing that is a distinguishing characteristic of AZA accreditation is helping us to be better over time. Our accreditation standards are constantly evolving and improving and raising the bar of performance. They're publicly available, and you can find them at our website, aza.org. That's aza.org. But AZA accreditation, as you know, is not the norm in the US zoological community. Our 217 US members represent less than 10% of the facilities holding USDA Class C licenses. So in 2014, AZA entered into a cooperative agreement with the USDA to develop a collaborative effort serving the entire Class C licensed zoological community. That agreement launched the Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Fusion Center, or as we like to call it, the ZAP, Z-A-P-H, ZAP Fusion Center. Its purpose is to bridge the gap between zoological facilities and the emergency management sector, encouraging an all hazards approach to help facilities become more prepared for and more resilient to hazards. The Fusion Center leverages existing expertise and disseminates critical information on prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. It builds and strengthens relationships with federal agencies, local and state emergency response organizations, and NGO animal response groups. It's developed a series of contingency planning modules to walk facilities through the process of creating all hazards contingency plans, including setting goals, identifying partners, performing a risk assessment, identifying needs and limitations, writing a plan, and importantly, training and implementing the plan. To help address the threat of disease outbreaks, and especially foreign animal diseases, ZAP developed the Secure Zoo strategy, a step-by-step guide designed to help facilities develop prevention, response, and mitigation plans. The strategy emphasizes the importance of biosecurity, including a mapping tool to help facility owners, operators, and veterinarians visualize biosecurity. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, ZAP has been a key resource for the broader zoological community, providing up-to-date resources and guidance as new information has been constantly emerging. ZAP's also helping to build capacity for regional response and recovery so that facilities and organizations can better help one another and local communities when needs arise. Facilitated preparedness meetings provide participants with an opportunity to learn about jurisdictional authority and resource availability, to share lessons learned from previous events, and discuss the concerns and unique challenges that zoological facilities face during and after disasters. All ZAP efforts are inclusive of the larger community and are made possible, again, I want to emphasize, through the continued support of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In the future, we hope to see increasing engagement and collaboration through a newly branded Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership. We're creating an advisory council to help guide efforts and promote engagement, and we'll announce additional opportunities for involvement over the coming year. And if you're interested to learn more about ZAP and the new Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership, you can sign up for our listserv at ZAHP, ZAP, zahp.aza.org. So the accreditation process has successfully established a culture of planning and preparation that is supporting animal welfare and wellness in a changing climate and in the face of increasingly disruptive natural disasters. With support from USDA, we've built and we're expanding a Zoo and Aquarium All Hazards Partnership to export this experience and capacity to the larger non-accredited community of USDA licensed exhibitors. This brings substantial welfare and wellness benefits to thousands upon thousands of animals at those facilities. And we'd like to go further. We support the 2012 contingency planning rule, and we're urging USDA to finalize this rule as soon as possible. We also support the Prepared Act, which has been discussed previously, and although this action appears unlikely this Congress, we hope that it will be enacted quickly in the next, and look forward to working with you all toward that goal. Climate change and climate disruption is real. We do know better, and we can do better. And I hope that you can see that we are committed to doing just that. Thanks for your time and attention today, and thank you for everything you do to make the world a better place for all of us, human and non-human. And I look forward to the discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, panelists, for those great presentations. I wanted to start the questioning, if I could, by asking you, Nancy, a question about the Farm Systems Reform Act. And the question is, how can this be used to affect change? I think you've covered some of that, but if you want to expand on that, please do. But more specifically, this legislation is now at a standstill in the Senate. And what do you think would happen if the Senate changed? It's now Republican controlled and would become Democrat controlled. Could we expect movement? And going further, if the administration changed itself, if the presidency changed from Republican to Democrat, might we expect more movement on this? So I'll stop there and get your answer on that.
That's a great question. It's really the $1 million question. I think we have to acknowledge that some change is going to be helpful when any legislation doesn't have a huge number of co-sponsors yet. And frankly, it's a fairly new bill, so it hasn't had a chance for that kind of exposure yet. That having a new Congress should provide us with an opportunity to go out there and start asking new members to join on to this kind of legislation. So I think it should enjoy some definite support from even just a change of pace on Capitol Hill. It's hard to break things down by party always, but there does appear, I think it's fair to say, to be some difference of opinion still between parties on the question of climate change. And we do enjoy more widespread support among Democrats on that issue. So I think that it should have some boost should there be a flip in the Senate. Yes, if there was a new administration, I think there'd be a more hospitable opportunity for that bill. I don't think we should have any illusion that that piece of legislation is going to fly through Congress regardless, because both Republicans and Democrats are pretty invested in the current agricultural system, the industrial elements of it. And we don't have enough removal from that or enough consensus yet that that's needed or a great cause of some of these problems. So I think we're going to see some benefits if we see changes. I think we're going to have to work for them. We can't take that for granted. And we're very hopeful that just the very nature of that dialogue taking place and being such a, at such a serious level will help boost the entire societal approach on this issue. So I think I'm optimistic.
Great, thank you. Let me see if our other panelists want to weigh in on that, and if not, we'll go to some other questions. Yep. Okay, so here's another question. For animals such as wild horses and burros who don't have protections, could part of the new way to think about protecting them be based on public lands they live on? We know that spaces animals live on in the wild that provide some form of protection, such as sanctuaries, monuments, and refuges, have been decreasing or are being opened up for industrial exploitation. In this anthropogenic age of changes, what can we do to challenge this idea of profit over protection? And I open that up to all the panelists. It's a great question.
I don't want to jump out ahead of anybody. I will say we work a good deal on that particular issue regarding wild horse and burro protection. And there is a federal statute that should be protecting them better than it is. But one of the challenges we have is the federal management scheme, FLIPMA, requires a balancing between these different interests. And so industrial and commercial needs are actually weighed equally with the needs of the horses, if not sometimes given advantages. And so I think we need a little bit more of an ethos change. We need Congress to tell the agency you need to put more value on protecting these animals. And we have slowly been seeing that dialogue happen, and recent fund increases for that agency. It's under Department of Interior, it's Bureau of Land Management. We've seen some real increases in their budget that have been tied to a demand that they treat these horses humanely, that they provide them with a better, more proactive management approach. So I have some optimism, but I think we all need to be moving together more on that issue and thinking pragmatically and remembering that climate change isn't going to wait for us to find the solutions. So we have to be aggressively seeking out collaborative opportunities.
Thank you. Would either Dan or Nathan like to comment on that?
I'll comment, and Paul and Nancy, I'll comment mostly in my previous capacity with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think wild horses and burros are one of the most difficult issues confronting land managers in the Western United States. I remember one time in a member of Congress's office with Neil Cornsey, who was then running the Bureau of Land Management. He said, there are two kinds of wildlife. The thousands of wildlife that Dan is responsible for, and the two that I'm responsible for. And so I think that my experience in the Fish and Wildlife Service, because quite frankly, the Fish and Wildlife Service isn't shackled by the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And so there are many places where the Fish and Wildlife Service has worked with the animal protection community and others to manage wild horses and burros, which wildlife managers consider non-native wildlife. And so to help achieve the goals of native wildlife conservation, like sage grouse and other native species, but also deal with wild horses and burros in a humane fashion. So I think there are good examples that are available on public lands, and I think we ought to try to move towards some of those solutions that have been built through consensus.
So I think I've got another question here. It strays a little bit from contingency planning, but I think it'd be a good question, Nathan, if you wouldn't mind trying to answer this, give an answer to this, given your talk. The question is that there's a great concern about the 500,000 shark killings due to the new coronavirus vaccine. And that's because researchers want to produce this vaccine from shark oil. Since the Animal Welfare Act doesn't include fish, mice, birds, etc., what could be a good strategy to incorporate the concept of animal welfare for these animals who are commonly excluded from legal protection? First, is that correct about the Animal Welfare Act? And I know you also discussed the Public Health Services Act. And second, what could be done to better protect these animals?
Yeah, it's a great question. COVID is presenting all sorts of interesting learning experiences as it relates to animal experimentation. I would say primarily that NIH itself has really sped up the regulatory process in such a way that sort of obviates the need for animal experimentation to do the toxicity testing in the first place. So that's probably the first point. As it relates specifically to fish, which aren't even considered under the Animal Welfare Act, they're not even specifically excluded. Mice, rats, and birds are in a slightly different situation where they've actually been specifically excluded. And so there's a number of ways that you can try to address some of these issues. The American Anti-Vivisection Society, for one, has been in longstanding litigation to try to get USDA to regulate birds under the Animal Welfare Act. And we recently submitted a petition in collaboration with Harvard's Animal Law Clinic to list cephalopods, octopus, and squid and the such, to have them regulated for the first time. They, in particular, have been explicitly excluded from both the Animal Welfare Act and from the NIH policies because they are not vertebrate animals. So this is another one of those strange situations where we do have because there's that dual regulatory structure between USDA's Animal Welfare Act, which very explicitly excludes the vast majority of animals that are used in animal experimentation, mice and rats, and increasingly fish, but have a much broader scope of coverage under the NIH's regulations that do allow us to capture some information about vertebrate animals across there. We mostly have gap filling issues to be working on as it relates to animals like sharks who are fish and explicitly excluded from the Animal Welfare Act coverage at this stage. The use of animal products in vaccines is a long-standing problem. We have both live vaccine, which is harvested from live animals. We have products all over the place. The annual flu vaccine includes egg yolk a lot of the time, and so if you're vegan, you probably want to try to find the options that are not based with egg. And we're going to increasingly see, this is the traditional capitalist argument for protecting wildlife in general, and is that there is some inherent economic value in a lot of these species. We want to shift that perspective and say that these species have inherent value in and of themselves, and that we just simply do not have the right to be harvesting things like sharks, like horseshoe crabs, to try to develop cures when there are alternatives available that are going to be equally or more effective than some of these animal-based options that are currently in the world.
Thank you. Nancy or Dan, did you want to comment on that? If not, we have a couple other questions we can try to get to.
I think Nathan did a great job.
Thanks, Nancy.
Okay. An A for Nathan on that one. Thank you. So let me ask this last question. It's directed to Nancy, but I did want to open it up for the entire panel. And because I think it's a good question to ask and get your perspective on. Do you believe that the disruptions that are described in factory farming and other animal based enterprises due to COVID-19 could have long-lasting positive impacts on our food system and on our thinking about animal cruelty and animal use, including the potential for a shift in the general public's attitudes towards farm factory meat and other animal uses? Just, comments on that, thoughts on that? We'll start with you, Nancy, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I like the optimism of the question. I would say that major change is difficult to create in society, and it often has to happen by necessity. And unfortunately, there are a lot of downsides to what has happened, as we've already talked about today. But I think there is something to the fact that everyone was forced into a new approach to finding food, and a lot of new streams, local networks, local farmer markets, and other better options were found by a lot of consumers, and other products that they might not have considered trying were tried. And I think that is the beginning of people getting comfortable with and making shifts around the system. I think we don't like unpredictability. We like predictability. We like stability. And so finding out how unstable and fragile our food system is was very helpful for helping consumers see the benefits, not just in terms of animal suffering that can be spared or health benefits of shifts, but also just stability that can be found through better food systems that are less fragile. So I think that there will be some change as a result of that, and I hope it will be long lasting.
Okay, well, we have maybe just time for one more question. So this is a question again for the entire panel, but Dan, I'd like to start with you on this one. You talked about really a system of self-regulation, which was your accreditation system for your members and the high standards that creates. And you also just mentioned that you support the Prepared Act, which Nancy spoke about, and I believe Nathan mentioned too. So could you just talk a little bit about this? I think the real interest here is, would if we do regulate and have a prepared act, would that lead to a culture of preparedness that you described, Dan? And how are these two complementary, or are they conflicting?
I think they're complementary, Paul. I think the idea of regulation, I think, is a good beginning point, and so the Animal Welfare Act certainly can and should be improved. But what I think it does is it sets a minimum standard. The purpose of a self-regulatory system like AZA accreditation is to put in place a framework that holds people to a higher set of standard. And I think it's complementary because I think what it does is it kind of demonstrates the art of the possible. It creates a network of professionalism where people are constantly innovating and sharing ideas and evolving best practices, which essentially show what is possible. And I would hope that in the future, the Animal Welfare Act and regulations under the Animal Welfare Act will follow that and adapt those innovations, and so that we'll constantly raise the bar in terms of what's possible, what's knowable, what's doable, what's possible with the care of animals within agricultural systems, within zoological framework, and so I do think that they're complementary. And I think, again, I'll take my hat off to the USDA for funding the Fusion Center and then working with us to kind of try to build that into a much larger partnership within the zoo and aquarium community to export standards from the AZA to the broader zoological community. And so, again, sharing the art of what's possible, what's doable within that community. And I think that's a larger model that could benefit other portions of animal care and welfare as well.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a really interesting and complete answer. But Nancy or Nathan, if you want to add something, please do.
I will just add that I think we had a good set of examples just in these presentations about the fact that these the accreditation approach, self-regulation, and a mandate work well together if they're done correctly, because the programs that Dan described today talk about training and support and education and all different ways that we can help those regulated entities or the entities in whatever business we're talking about. We can help them see, as Dan just said, the possibilities and move toward them. But in the end, you're going to need a mandate. And so I think you need the combination of helping people make the change and doing that in their own pacing, but getting to a point where you codify that, because we don't want bad actors to slip through just because they took advantage of the loopholes. And we really want society to put a stamp of approval on what we think ultimately needs to be the situation and make that the norm through the law.
Yeah, and sorry, do you mind if I jump in really quickly?
Please.
In the context of labs, I think it's maybe a parallel type of experience to some of the ones for these other regulated spaces. The accrediting agency that we deal with most often for animal labs is called ALAC, and ALAC serves more to defend the labs from folks like our organization at Rise for Animals than it does to actually achieve the objectives of welfare at those facilities. In my experience, that's my opinion. And I think we need to shift the frame away from some of these trade group type of accrediting agencies from protecting an industry to accomplishing the missions that they arguably have to ensure the welfare of the animals that are under their care, that society has given to them as a special exemption from the way that we would normally expect people to take care of animals. Right now, in our space in particular, there's been a coordinated effort by ALAC and other organizations in this space to try to deregulate the animal experimentation space.
And I find that incredibly problematic, and would urge advocates in this space to I think build off of what Nancy was saying, to really try to codify this in law and regulation rather than relying exclusively on accrediting agencies.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time now, so thanks everyone for joining us. This is the last panel of a great meeting. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. And I will just say that this concludes the 28th Annual Animal Law Conference. We hope to see you in person in Baltimore, Maryland. Yay, Baltimore. I have to say that as a Hopkins person. For the next annual Animal Law Conference, which is going to be on October 15th to 17th, 2021, hopefully in person. So again, thanks for joining us today. And I will leave you now to get on with the rest of your weekend.
Vote.
And Nathan, thank you.
Vote.
Vote. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.